They were not gentle words, and no one at the auction pretended they were. A woman of 20, standing alone on a splintered dock with $9 sewn into the hem of her only good dress, had just bid on a ruin that the whole town of Hallow Bend, Oregon, had spent 3 years trying to forget. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she had lost her father, her home, and her good name in the same terrible season, cast out by the man who had once called himself her father's partner and friend. All she carried into that cold September morning was a small canvas satchel, a widow's worth of coin, and a stubbornness that had not yet learned when to quit. What she bought that day, the blackened shell of the old Hallow Bend Cannery, and the smokehouse crouched behind it like a forgotten grave, was considered by every soul on the wharf to be nothing but rot, ash, and bad luck bricked into 4 crumbling walls. But sealed beneath that smokehouse floor was something no one living had dared to speak of in a decade, a secret that would not only restore everything Clara Whitfield had lost, but would return to an entire town what had quietly, cruelly been stolen from it. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you are watching this from a town that time seems to have passed over, or from a place that people call finished, tell us where you're from in the comments. We would love to know we are not the only ones who believe forgotten places still have something left to give. And if stories like this one settle into you the way they settle into us, we'd be glad to have you stay a while longer. Follow or subscribe to the channel so you don't miss where Clara's story, and the ones after it, will lead. Clara had been born in the spring of 1877 in a narrow clapboard house that looked out over the gray Pacific from a bluff above Hallow Bend, a fishing town wedged between headland and river mouth on the Oregon coast. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, had built his life around salt and smoke and patience, the old unglamorous trade of preserving what the sea gave up before it could spoil. He had learned it from his own father, who had learned it from a Chinook fisherman named Old Tamson, who had shown him, as a boy, how to read the grain of alder wood and know exactly when a fillet had taken enough smoke to keep through winter without losing its sweetness. Thomas Whitfield was not a rich man, but he was known up and down that stretch of coast as an honest one, and in a trade built on the trust of strangers who could not watch their fish once it left their hands, honesty was worth more than gold. Clara grew up in the curing sheds instead of a parlor. While other girls in Hallow Bend were taught embroidery, she was taught the 4 stages of a proper brine, the smell of alder smoke gone bitter from too much heat, and the particular hush that fell over a smokehouse in the last hour before the fish was ready, when a person had to simply wait and trust and not open the door too soon out of impatience. Her father used to tell her that the smokehouse punished haste and rewarded faith, and that most of life, if she paid attention, worked the very same way. She loved him fiercely, and she loved the work almost as much, because in it she saw something her father saw too. That unglamorous, patient labor, done honestly, was a kind of dignity that no one could auction away from a person, no matter how poor they became. When Clara was 17, a man named Cornelius Vance arrived in Hallow Bend with capital, ambition, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He proposed a partnership to her father. Vance would provide the money to expand the modest curing operation into a proper cannery, modern tins, a rail contract to Portland, real prosperity for the whole town. And Thomas Whitfield's name would remain on the deed as an equal partner. Thomas, who had spent his whole life scraping by on fair prices and hard winters, wanted desperately to believe that such fortune could simply arrive, deserved, at his door. He signed the papers Vance placed in front of him, trusting a stranger's ink the way he trusted the tide, because it had never once occurred to him that the tide could be told which way to run. For 2 years, the Hallow Bend Cannery prospered, and Thomas Whitfield believed himself blessed. Clara worked alongside her father in the new brick smokehouse Vance had financed, a fine building with iron hooks and triple flues, built, Vance said, to last 100 years. She did not yet understand that the deed her father had signed contained clauses about debt and default written in a legal hand, meant to be misread by an honest man in a hurry. Nor that Cornelius Vance had never intended the partnership to survive its first hard season. The hard season came in the autumn of 1896, when an early storm wrecked half the fishing fleet in a single terrible night, and a fire, weeks later, tore through the original curing sheds. Thomas Whitfield, already stretched thin covering losses Vance quietly refused to share, found himself presented with a stack of notes claiming debts he did not recognize. Debts Vance insisted had been incurred in Thomas's name to cover cannery expansions Thomas had never approved. Within a month, Cornelius Vance had used those very notes, and the clauses buried in that old partnership deed, to claim sole ownership of the cannery entire, and to declare Thomas Whitfield a debtor who had defaulted on his obligations. It was Vance, standing on the same dock where the town had once celebrated the cannery's opening, who announced that the Whitfield family's tenancy in the company house was likewise ended, effective within the week, as partial settlement of the debt. Thomas Whitfield did not live to see the following spring. The doctor called it a weakness of the heart, but the men who had known him all their lives said, quietly, that it was shame that killed him. The particular shame of a man who had trusted the wrong hand and lost, in doing so, the only inheritance he had to leave his daughter. Clara buried her father in the small windswept cemetery above Hallow Bend in March of 1897, and by April, Cornelius Vance's foreman had come to inform her, not unkindly but not gently either, that the house was needed for cannery staff, and that she would need to be gone by the 1st of May. She left with what she could carry: a trunk of her mother's linens, her father's smoking knife wrapped in oilcloth, and $41 that represented every cent the family had managed to keep clear of Vance's ledgers. She took a room above the mercantile for a time, mending nets and taking in laundry, watching the $41 dwindle toward $9, and watching Cornelius Vance's new cannery, built from her father's craft, on her father's reputation, using the very brine recipes Thomas Whitfield had shared in good faith, grow larger and more prosperous with every passing month, while the fishing families of Hallow Bend, who once sold their catch for a fair price, now sold it to Vance at whatever price he named, because he was the only buyer left on that stretch of coast. By September, Clara Whitfield had $9 and a decision to make. And it was in that same month that word went around Hallow Bend that Vance was finally clearing out an older, smaller property he had bought up years before and let stand idle, the original Hallow Bend cannery building, damaged in that long-ago fire, and the smokehouse behind it, sealed and untouched since the day Vance took possession of everything Thomas Whitfield had built. The county was auctioning it for unpaid taxes, since even Vance, it seemed, had not thought the burned-out ruin worth the trouble of holding on to. The auction was held on the cannery's own sagging porch, presided over by a tax assessor from the county seat, who read out the parcel description in a bored monotone while a dozen townsfolk stood in the cold to watch, more out of curiosity than interest, since no sensible person wanted the place. The smokehouse, everyone agreed, had gone strange after the fire. Vance himself had ordered its door boarded shut the same week he took over the property, and had never once, in all the years since, permitted anyone inside it, not even to salvage the iron fittings, which any practical man would have stripped for their worth. Rumor had grown up around that locked door the way barnacles grow on a hull, each town gossip adding a little more to what was already there, until half of Hallow Bend believed the smokehouse haunted, and the other half simply believed it cursed by Vance's own bad business, And either way, no one wanted it. Clara Whitfield stood at the back of that small crowd with $9 in her hand and her father's memory heavy in her chest. And when the assessor asked, almost as a formality, if anyone would bid on the parcel, she heard her own voice answer before she had entirely decided to speak. Old Silas Broom, who ran the ship's chandlery and had known Thomas Whitfield since they were boys, turned to her with real concern on his weathered face and said the words that would follow her for years afterward. "You'll regret this, girl. That place has taken enough from your family already." But Clara, who had spent 5 months learning exactly how little regret mattered next to hunger, raised her hand again, and for $9, every cent she had left in the world. The burned cannery and its sealed smokehouse became hers. She moved in that same week, because she had nowhere else to move to. The main cannery building was little more than charred framing and a leaking roof, but the smokehouse behind it, though boarded shut for years, had been built of good brick and had survived the fire nearly untouched. It took her the better part of 2 days, working alone with a pry bar borrowed from Silas Broom, to finally break the boards away from the door Vance had sealed. And when she stepped inside for the first time in October of 1897, she expected nothing more than mold, mice, and the particular sadness of an abandoned room. What she found instead was dust undisturbed for years, the old iron smoking hooks still hanging from the rafters exactly as her father might have hung them, and, tucked into a gap behind a loose hearthstone near the old firebox, a small tin box that someone had clearly hidden there and never returned to collect. Inside the tin box, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, Clara found a single folded letter, unsigned, and a heavy iron key unlike any she had ever seen, its bow worked into the shape of a fish, with its tail curled round to meet its head. The letter was short, written in a hand she did not recognize, and it said only this, that what had been taken from the men of Hallow Bend in the hard winter of 1889 lay beneath the ash where none would think to look, and that whoever found it should remember it was never the finder's to keep, but the town's to receive. Clara read those words 3 times by lamplight, feeling the hair rise on her arms, understanding that she had just uncovered the very first thread of something far larger than a $9 ruin. Something that reached back into Hallow Bend's history a full 8 years before Cornelius Vance had ever set foot on that dock. She spent the following weeks doing what her father had taught her better than anyone. She paid attention, and she waited. She learned, through careful questions to Silas Broom and to old Widow Price, who had kept the Hallow Bend general accounts for 30 years, that the original cannery and smokehouse had not been built by Cornelius Vance at all, but by his own father, a man named Elias Vance, who had come to the coast in the 1880s with grand plans for a fishermen's cooperative, a scheme by which every family who fished those waters would pool their catch, share in a common cannery, and split the profits according to their labor, rather than selling each boatload separately to whichever middleman offered the lowest price out of desperation. It had been, by every account Clara could gather, a genuinely good idea, and for several years it had genuinely worked, until the terrible winter of 1889, when an unusually violent series of storms wrecked nearly a third of the fleet, and a fire damaged the original curing sheds, leaving the young cooperative with debts it could not immediately cover, and fishing families who desperately needed their promised shares simply to survive until spring. Elias Vance, according to Widow Price, had told the town that the cooperative's reserve fund, silver coin set aside precisely for such a disaster, contributed faithfully over years by every fishing family in Hallow Bend as insurance against exactly this kind of ruin, had been lost in the same fire that damaged the sheds. He had grieved publicly over the loss, closed the cooperative books, and within a year had quietly left Hollow Bend for California, leaving his young son Cornelius, barely out of his own boyhood then, to be raised elsewhere before returning years later. Grown and wealthy from investments no one in Hollow Bend had ever quite understood, to buy up the very cannery his father had abandoned and rebuild it as his own private enterprise. No one in all those years had ever seriously questioned whether the reserve fund had truly burned, because Elias Vance had wept so convincingly at the town meeting where he announced its loss, and grief, in a small town, tends to be taken at face value. Clara returned to the smokehouse with new eyes and a growing, careful suspicion. She examined the hearthstone where she had found the tin box more closely, and noticed what she had missed before in the dim light, a section of brick flooring near the old firebox that did not sit quite level with the rest, its mortar lines subtly different in color from the surrounding work, as though it had been laid by a different hand, at a different time, with different purpose. Using the pry bar again, and with considerable effort, she worked loose enough of the flooring to reveal a narrow stone stairway descending beneath the smokehouse, sealed at its base by a heavy timber door bound in iron, secured with a lock shaped, she realized with a chill, exactly to match the strange fish-headed key she had found in the tin box. The tunnel beneath the smokehouse, when Clara finally worked up the courage to descend into it by lamplight, was not long, perhaps 30 feet, but it was dry, well built, and clearly constructed with real care rather than haste, running from beneath the smokehouse toward the old cannery's original foundation. At its far end, in a small chamber shored up with brick and timber, she found what Elias Vance had truly done with the cooperative's reserve fund in the winter of 1889. It had not burned at all. Wrapped carefully in oiled canvas and stored in a series of iron-banded chests, exactly as it must have been the day it was hidden away, lay the silver coin of an entire town's collective insurance, along with a ledger book, water-stained but legible, recording in Elias Vance's own careful hand every family's contribution over the cooperative's years, and a second, more damning ledger recording his private intention, dated just weeks before he announced the fund's supposed loss, to withdraw it quietly for his own use and claim disaster had taken it instead, so that he might use the untouched silver to finance a new venture in California, without the burden of Hollow Bend's dependent fishing families weighing on his conscience or his balance sheet. Clara sat alone in that stone chamber for a long while, the lamp burning low, understanding at last the full shape of what she had bought for $9, and what it meant not only for her own ruined fortunes, but for every family in Hollow Bend who had spent 8 years believing a fire had stolen their winter insurance, when in truth it had simply been hidden by the very man they trusted to protect it, and inherited, unknowingly or not, by the son who had gone on to ruin her own father, using the very same cooperative's good name and reputation as his foundation. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it did not take long for Cornelius Vance to hear that the Whitfield girl had been seen carrying strange old ledgers out of the smokehouse he had kept sealed for a decade. He arrived at Clara's door on a gray morning in November, dressed as immaculately as ever, and informed her, with the same smile he had once used on her father, that whatever she believed she had found on that property legally belonged to him, since he was Elias Vance's heir, and any assets connected to the old cooperative would rightly pass through the family line. Clara, who had spent 5 months learning that Vance's smile meant nothing at all about his intentions, told him only that she would need to consult a lawyer in the county seat before discussing the matter further, and closed the door before he could answer. What followed was a slow, uncomfortable season of pressure, applied the way men like Vance always applied it. Quietly, through channels rather than confrontation. He spoke to the bank in Astoria and made it known that Clara Whitfield's small account should not be extended credit. He spoke to the county assessor and questioned, none too subtly, whether the original auction of her property had been properly conducted, hinting at irregularities that did not exist. He let it be known among the fishing families that any who spoke too openly to the Whitfield girl about old cooperative business might find their catch priced less favorably at his cannery come spring. Several families, frightened for their own survival, urged Clara privately to simply hand the ledgers over and be done with it, to take whatever quiet settlement Vance might offer, and let the old history stay buried where it had lain for 8 years, since digging it up seemed only to invite more trouble onto a young woman who already had precious little left to lose. But Clara Whitfield had inherited more from her father than a smoking knife and a recipe for brine. She had inherited his stubborn, patient faith that honest things, given enough time and enough light, tend to reveal themselves properly. The same faith that told a smokehouse door not to be opened before the fish was ready. She spent that difficult winter traveling, when she could scrape together the fare to the county seat, where she consulted a young lawyer named Amos Teal, newly arrived from Portland and not yet beholden to any of Vance's quiet influence, who examined the ledgers and the original cooperative charter, still on file at the county courthouse, and confirmed what Clara had already suspected, that under the cooperative's own founding terms, the reserve fund had never legally belonged to Elias Vance nor his heirs at all, but had always remained the collective property of the contributing fishing families and their descendants, meaning Cornelius Vance had no more legitimate claim to it than any stranger passing through town. Armed with Teal's confirmation, Clara did the one thing Cornelius Vance had least expected of a young woman he had already dismissed once as inconsequential. Rather than fighting him quietly through lawyers, where his money and influence held every advantage, she called for a town meeting to be held in the old Grange Hall in the first week of March 1898, and invited every fishing family in Hollow Bend to attend, promising them an accounting of something that concerned them all directly. The Grange Hall was fuller that evening than it had been in years, packed with fishermen and their wives and children who had heard only rumors of what the Whitfield girl intended to say, and Cornelius Vance himself arrived uninvited, standing near the back with his arms folded, confident that whatever accusation this ruined girl intended to make, his standing in the town would easily outweigh it. Clara stood at the front of that hall, with her father's smoking knife in her satchel, not as a weapon, but as a reminder to herself of why she had come this far. And she laid out, plainly and without embellishment, the story the ledgers told, Elias Vance's true handling of the cooperative fund in 1889, his deliberate deception of the very families who had trusted him, and his quiet departure with what should rightfully have sustained them through that hard winter and beyond. She read aloud, in a voice that did not shake, though her hands did, the damning entry in Elias Vance's own hand, confirming his intention to withdraw the fund before ever announcing its supposed loss by fire. The silence that followed in that Grange Hall was the silence of an entire town recalculating 8 years of hardship it had believed was simply bad fortune, and beginning instead to understand it as theft. Cornelius Vance tried, for a moment, to speak over the murmur rising around him, insisting the ledgers were forgeries, that the girl was desperate and dangerous, that no one should trust the word of a woman already ruined by her own father's debts. But Silas Broom, who had known both Whitfields and both Vances across 3 decades, stood and asked the one question Cornelius could not answer cleanly. If the fund had truly burned in 1889 as his father claimed, how had it come to be found? Whole and untouched, sealed beneath the very smokehouse Cornelius himself had ordered boarded shut the day he took possession of the cannery, and never once allowed a single person to enter in all the years since. Cornelius Vance had no honest answer to give, because there was none, and the town of Hallow Bend, watching him fumble for one, understood in that moment exactly what kind of inheritance he had truly received from his father, and exactly what kind of man he had chosen to remain. Clara did not seek to punish Cornelius Vance through the courts, though Amos Teal assured her she had every right to. What she wanted instead, and what she told the Grange Hall that night with her father's steadiness in her voice, was for the reserve fund to finally do what it had always been meant to do: return to the families who had built it, in shares calculated fairly according to Widow Price's careful old contribution records, so that the daughters and sons of those fishermen might finally receive, 9 years late, the winter insurance their fathers had paid into faithfully and never once seen returned. The silver, distributed that spring under Amos Teal's careful legal oversight, was not a fortune for any single family. But it was enough to repair boats, clear debts, and buy seed and salt for a season. And it arrived at a moment when Cornelius Vance's standing in Hallow Bend had crumbled so thoroughly that families who had once feared his pricing began instead to bring their catch to the rebuilt cannery Clara herself was slowly restoring, brick by brick, using what remained of the old cooperative's founding charter as its legal foundation once more. Cornelius Vance did not leave Hallow Bend in disgrace, exactly, for the law found no clean way to charge a son for his father's long-ago deception. But he found, in the months that followed, that his cannery's docks grew quieter, that fishing families who once had nowhere else to sell now had a choice, and chose, more often than not, to sell to the young woman who had returned their inheritance, rather than the family whose name had concealed it for a decade. Within 2 years, Vance had quietly sold his enterprise to a company out of Portland and left the coast entirely. And the justice that found him was not loud or dramatic, but the older kind of justice, the kind delivered by ordinary people simply choosing, at last, where to place their trust. Clara Whitfield rebuilt the Hallow Bend Cannery not as her own private enterprise, as Cornelius Vance had done, but as her father would have wanted it, and as Elias Vance had once, however imperfectly, imagined it. A cooperative, owned in shares by the fishing families who supplied it, with the old smokehouse restored as its beating heart, its iron hooks once again hung with fish smoked slow over alder wood, exactly as her father had taught her, patiently, without haste, trusting the process to do what it was meant to do in its own good time. She kept the strange fish-headed key on a cord around her neck for the rest of her days, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the night she had learned that the things people warn you away from most loudly are sometimes exactly the things most worth uncovering, if you are patient enough and honest enough to see what is truly hidden beneath the ash. And so we return to where we began, to a girl of 20, standing alone on a splintered dock with $9 in her hand, buying a burned-out ruin that an entire town had already given up on, while a kind old man warned her, in good faith, that she would surely regret it. Clara Whitfield never did regret it, not once, not even in the hardest weeks of that first uncertain winter, because what she understood, and what her father had spent his whole life quietly teaching her, was that value does not always announce itself, and that the things the world discards as worthless are sometimes simply waiting for someone patient enough to look past the ash and find what was owed underneath. She did not restore that cannery to make herself wealthy. She restored it because it was the honest thing to do, and in doing the honest thing, she found that an entire town's fortune had been waiting there all along, sealed in the dark, for someone brave enough to open the door. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Clara Whitfield, and with the sealed tunnel beneath the old smokehouse that changed far more than one young woman's fortune. If this story found something in you, some memory of a person, a place, or even an old forgotten object that turned out to be worth more than anyone believed, We would love for you to share it with us in the comments below, and to share this video with anyone who needs reminding that overlooked things are not always worthless things. We'll leave you tonight with the same question Clara might have asked herself on that cold September dock. What is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? Until next time, stay close.